सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen though.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Every now and then, many of you complain that we overdo Pakistan, that we somehow look at Pakistan far too often. At this point, however, most of you could complain that we haven't been looking at Pakistan. If anything, you could hold me guilty of taking my eye off the ball, because really important things have happened in Pakistan or about Pakistan. Now, I have my excuses, one of which, a good excuse, a reasonable excuse, is that a lot's been happening at home, particularly with the unfortunate events in Manipur, which have taken a lot of our attention, and lots of other developments, the coming up of a new opposition alliance, etc., etc. Parliament session has begun. Other international developments have been taking place. At the same time, this should have given me no excuse to have overlooked the fine print that came with the IMF bailout for Pakistan. Now, IMF gave a bailout to Pakistan. They gave a standby arrangement of $3 billion, or about $3 billion, of which $1.2 billion was dispensed. That's like immediate oxygen and a shot of steroid, etc., to keep Pakistan going, which is what has happened now. I would also say, in my defense, that I would have thought, like anybody would have thought, that an IMF bailout for Pakistan is not such a big story, because Pakistan is addicted to IMF. Pakistan is addicted to IMF like an opium addict is addicted to opiates of one kind or the other. Pakistan's opiate is the IMF. And I'm not exaggerating, because with the new arrangement, the new standby arrangement, also comes a large report by the IMF staff on Pakistan. So the fine print is not just 1 or 2 pages or a few lines. The fine print is 120 plus pages. And if you read this, it's like, you've read this before, you've read this before, you've read this before, you've read this before. Now, it's not as if some needle has got stuck on my record. It's because it's the 24th time that the Pakistan has got an IMF loan. 24th time. And I'm sure each one of those times, if you go back to IMF's website and read the IMF reports with each loan, you will find similar sort of problems and similar sort of solutions. And once again, soon enough, Pakistan goes back to the IMF and the same charade starts again. So you know what? This is a circular debt situation, because IMF loans money to Pakistan. Pakistan uses it for some time. A few things happen for the better with Pakistan's economy, and then again back to the old ways and back to the IMF. So Pakistan has just been through one of those phases, going back to the IMF yet again. Now 24 times, and 24 times not beginning in 1947, but beginning in 1958. What does Pakistan do? Where does Pakistan go so wrong? What is it that the IMF sees right now by way of the situation in Pakistan? What is it that it suggests? So what I will do is, I will talk briefly about a few key aspects. All of this is too much. This is like 3 classroom lectures that somebody has to give me. I can't give to you. So I'm not an economist. I'm a journalist. So I can't give you those 3 or 5 or 6 1-hour lectures on what this means for the state of Pakistan's economy. There are fine economists in Pakistan and fine economists of Pakistani origin, one of whom I will also quote from today with gratitude, because it takes a lot of doing to speak the truth, as Dr. Manmohan Singh had spoken and Narasimha Rao had spoken, and Narasimha Rao had backed him for speaking in 1991. Because when you mess up, the first thing to do if you want to clean up your act is to own up to your mess and to say that I did it, no one else did it. That we haven't seen as yet from Pakistani utterances. But let us see, first of all, what is it that the IMF is telling us about Pakistan. First of all, it's a 9-month standby agreement of $3 billion, of which about $1.2 billion has been given out just now. Even then, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves, which are today down to about 3 weeks imports. At this point, there are about 3 weeks imports, that is $4.2 billion. But even with this, if everything goes all right over the next 3 or 4 years, Pakistan will still not have more than 1.2, 1.3, at the most 1.5 months imports worth of foreign exchange reserves. So that is the problem. Look at Pakistan's inflation situation right now, 38%. So foreign exchange reserves of 4.2 billion. All of this is from this IMF report. Foreign exchange reserves of 4.2 billion in comparison. And this is not to say we are so much greater than those guys. In comparison, India's foreign exchange reserves may be going up or down by $4 billion odd dollars in a week and nobody would notice. At last count, India's forex reserves were $604 billion. So this is $4 billion, $4.2 billion for Pakistan. May inflation for Pakistan, again, IMF report, the same document, 38%. This kind of economic situation has been leading to social discontent. It's eroding living standards and it is creating political and institutional fissures which are now coming to the fore. It also goes on to note that credit rating agencies have downgraded Pakistan to just above default levels. Then it gives you a very good progress report on Pakistan, because Pakistan's Extended Fund Facility, or EFF, which started in 2019, the last time they went to IMF. So what's happened in the 4 years since then? And that is where some really interesting stuff comes in. So they say that the Pakistani economy, they kept on flattering to deceive. My words, not theirs. They kept on flattering to deceive. So I'm actually making a lot of what economists have written there, concise in one phrase. And they say that, now I'm quoting them, Pakistan's economy kept repeatedly going off the rails, especially after a review. So IMF, when it gives you money, any lender, a bank, anybody, when they give you money, lend you money, they carry out a periodic review to see that you are using the money for the purpose for which you had taken. If you promised certain financial discipline, are you following that discipline or not? Are you capable of paying back or not? Are your actions making it more likely that you will repay the loans, or less likely that you will repay the loans? So IMF report tells us that after that, until a review, Pakistani compliance improved, and after a review, it collapsed. So that's really like a troublesome school kid, right? When the inspection time is coming, you know, teacher will come to inspect, you improve your stuff, and then as soon as the teacher goes away, you again go back to your old ways. They also go on to say, IMF also goes on to say, that in the first half of this 4-year period, there were many improvements in Pakistan, but it completely became a victim of policy reversals in the second half. So we know what happened in the second half. That's when Imran Khan got into his completely, totally, and I would say self-destructively for Pakistan, populist mode. So to understand this better, what better can we do but to borrow 2 graphics from the IMF report itself? You will find these on page 6 of the IMF report. I'm sharing a link of the entire report with you. You can check it out, but you will see these graphics on your screen. So thank you, IMF. So first is the graphic that tells you the status of Pakistan's gross foreign exchange reserves. And you can see, and the beginning period is when this current EFF approval came. That is the IMF, the last IMF bailout came, extended fund facility. That was in May 19, right? After May 19, you can see that Pakistan's reserves have gone up. They've gone up not that much, but they've gone up to almost $20 billion in 2021. And then you get into Imran Khan's super populist phase combined with the COVID pressures, and they've come down to $4.2 billion, which is not much more than what they were when the Pakistanis started with the last EFF approval. This graphic should be headlined. I'm not changing the headline from the IMF has it because it's their graphic, but this graphic is more aptly headlined back to square one. So the Pakistanis start in 2019 with the EFF approval from IMF at this level. They go like this and they come right back there. So that's back to square one. The next chart on the same page, look at Pakistan's tax revenues as a percentage of GDP. So they've rarely reached 10% or barely reached 10%. They have not risen at all. They've remained constant. Compare that with the goal that IMF had set up. That is the last bar on this chart. That is about 14% or a bit more than 14%. So once again, Pakistan has failed on that count. If anything, as a percentage of GDP, Pakistan's tax revenue has declined. Then you see again from page 7 of the same report, you see this graphic again we take from the IMF. These are key high frequency indicators. That is cement dispatches, car sales, and large-scale manufacturing index. Each one again starts from where the IMF bailout began, 2019, to where we have come now. 2 of the 3 have come either to the same level as before or fallen a little bit below. Only one is a little bit up, that too in this year, in 2023, that is cement dispatches. Little bit up compared to last year. That could be the after effect of the floods, etc., because new constructions are taking place. But once again, while there is a little bit of an increase, this is not like going back to any boom times. It's just a little bit of a rise in 2023. Then you look at inflation, and that's the key graphic. Inflation, you have 2 lines there. One is core inflation, that's a lower line, and then is the headline inflation. If you look at headline inflation, it's now gone up to 38%. Core inflation is just around 20% or maybe a little bit above 20%. See that graphic and see how both have risen. This is again coincided with Imran Khan's populist politics. So, populist politics is fine. It can also win you votes, but somebody's got to pay for it. And if you are a sovereign, if you are a nation, then it is a taxpayer in your country who ends up paying it. And if you have a lot of taxpayers, or if your taxpayer is very honest and you're collecting, and if your tax collector is very honest, then you're collecting a lot of taxes and you can pay for this indulgence. If you cannot, then you end up going to the IMF. And that's what's happened to Pakistan right now. Again, look at this graphic. This graphic tells us, this is from page 8, this graphic tells us the status of Pakistan's exchange rate or the value of Pakistani rupee. So you can see the value of the Pakistani rupee right through 2022 has been mostly stable. You then see, come 2023, it goes up vertically like this. Goes up means the value of the rupee falls. You get more rupees in a dollar, or you have to pay more rupee to buy dollars, and then it has remained sort of stable. It has again fallen a little bit, but has been a bit stable. That's because over 2022, again because of populism, Pakistan government were keeping rupee artificially strong. They were keeping the rupee artificially strong, but the market knew it. So open market premium was much higher. So while you can see the line, you can see the solid line. The solid line tells you what was the bank rate. But you see these other lines, those lines denote the gap between the bank rate and what the market thought the rate was. And that's the rate at which the market was selling it to the dollar. Then under IMF's demands, Pakistan allowed their rupee to find a more market denominated level. So Pakistani rupee has now reached to about 290, 292, 295 to the dollar and has been stable there. You can see that the open market premium has almost become negligible now. IMF also tells us about Pakistan's likely growth picture, and once again it's not a pretty picture. They say 2020 minus 0.9%, 2021 5.8%. Now that one is because of the previous year's pandemic degrowth, right? India also had a degrowth in 2020, but also because IMF also notes it that Pakistan bought growth very expensively. That is by putting out a lot of money in the market through fiscal imprudence, giving out a lot of loans from its banks. Also the government indulging in a lot of profligacy under Imran, which is what has brought them to IMF once again. So 5.8% in 21. 2022 again 6.1, but as I mentioned to you earlier, IMF says this was expensively bought, this growth. 2023 as as reality has struck back, minus 0.5% for 2024 if Pakistan carries out all the reforms that IMF wants them to. 2.5%, 2025 it goes to 3.6 and then 4.5, and then it remains for the following 2 years at 5% growth. In 2027, 2028, Pakistan is still only at 5% growth. And even at that level, even in 2028, Pakistan's gross foreign exchange reserves will add up to about 1.9 months imports. And yet with all these reforms, even if all these reforms are carried out by 2027 and in 2028, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves will be about $15 billion or about 1.9 months, a little less than 2 months imports. The one area in which Pakistan seems to be doing surprisingly not so badly, although the IMF doesn't like it, but I would also say, in fairness, better than India. That is fiscal deficit. Pakistan's fiscal deficit is in the 4% zone. India's right now is in the 6% zone. It was 6.5. It's been cut a little bit by a few basis points. And India is now promising to bring it down. But India is a much larger economy, and India does not have many of the problems, the more severe problems that the Pakistani economy has structurally. So India can handle it, not forever, not for long, but India can handle it now. That said, at this point, fiscal deficit Pakistan is not as bad as you might imagine it to be. What Pakistan is getting, in fact, in return from IMF is a lot of tender love and care, a lot of TLC, because of climate change and because of Pakistan's natural disaster. So from page 49, for example, we pick up this graphic from the IMF report, which tells us the proportion of floods in Pakistan's disaster damage. And you can see, if you see these three graphics, three pie charts, you can see the floods constitute a bulk of the damage caused by natural disasters to Pakistan, except on the middle graphic, which is about fatalities. Obviously, more fatalities are caused by earthquakes than by floods. Otherwise, floods are the biggest threat to Pakistan in terms of the larger disasters, and the floods and climate change have a very solid link, and that's why IMF is being very forgiving with Pakistan, hoping that they will employ some of these funds also addressing the issues of climate change. IMF report also tells us where Pakistan's debt is coming from. So 42.2% of Pakistan's debt comes from multilateral lending and institutions that must be World Bank, ADB, etc., etc. IMF already has 18% of Pakistan's debt. Debt from IMF constitutes 18% of Pakistan's total debt. China is the third largest, that is 10%, which then adds up to 7% of Pakistan's GDP. So China is the biggest sovereign lender to Pakistan. What you might find particularly fascinating with this report, if you go and click on the link and go right towards the end, it's a long memorandum on economic and financial policies that Pakistan's finance minister and Pakistan's governor of Central Bank, of State Bank of Pakistan, as they call their central bank, they jointly wrote to the IMF boss, that is Kristalina Georgieva. Now, this is a very detailed report. This is like a patient going into the ICU and giving a self-diagnosis. Also writing a confession there that, look, you might find that my blood pressure has gone out the window. You might find that my weight, my blood sugar have gone out of the window. You might find my coronaries are clogged, but that's because I've been eating all the wrong stuff. I've not been exercising. I've been smoking and drinking what I should not have been, right? If you read it, in fact, it's almost intrusive, and it also reminds you of the consequences of profligacy. If you live irresponsibly, then whether you're a human being or a nation, ultimately you have to go to the ICU. And when you go to the ICU, then you have to let the doctor look into everything and all the scans and all the blood reports and everything. If you're an individual, you get the gift of confidentiality, or at least you're supposed to get the gift of confidentiality. But if you're a sovereign, if you're a nation, and if you go to borrow like this from a multilateral institutions, everything has to be made public. So all these confessions are public. And if you see all these confessions from Pakistani for a finance minister and central bank governor, and the prescription that Dr. IMF has given out, that's also a lengthy section in this 120 plus page report. If you read that, then you know how much of sovereignty a nation has to compromise on when they go to the IMF looking for money like this. That is the moment of truth that India had faced in the summer of 1991. Now, I take you back there because I also read a series of tweets by a very wise Pakistani. This is a Pakistani economist, Murtaza Syed, who is right now a senior official at AIIB, which is Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing. He has worked in the past at IMF also has been Deputy Governor of State Bank of Pakistan. Now he's put out a series of tweets on the IMF loan and the IMF report. In the first one, and you will see these tweets run on your screen as I talk. In the first one, he says, this has marked the start of our 24th waltz together. 24th waltz means 24th time Pakistan has gone to IMF to ask for money. And he says, if you read the IMF report, it's like IMF is saying it's an SOS, it's a last call. Then again, I quote from his next tweet. He says, we are addicted to IMF's tough love, right? And he says, we are their most loyal customer. Argentina comes second with 21 bailouts. And then he mentions that our midnight twin, India has gone to IMF only once. Actually, India has gone to IMF, I think twice, at least twice. He said India has gone to IMF only once. I think once India went to IMF under Mrs. Gandhi also, when she came back after the emergency. But he says India has gone to IMF only once. And then he quotes from Dr. Manmohan Singh's speech in 1991. And he says that speech tells us you must first tell the truth, correctly diagnose your problem, trust economic experts, provide them political cover. Otherwise, you are not going to go anywhere. Otherwise, you will be back to where you were, as Pakistan have been this time. I showed you in those earlier graphics, which I would have liked to title, I would have liked to headline, back to square one. And then he goes on to quote from Dr. Manmohan Singh's speech in 1991. And he said that Dr. Manmohan Singh said in that speech, if I fail, it is of no great consequence. But who fails if India wins? Which means if India wins, then everybody is won, right? And he says that is the kind of attitude that we now need from Pakistan's leaders. Again, Murtaza Syed goes on to say that the IMF has come as close to declaring our debt, Pakistan's debt, unsustainable as it can diplomatically do. Then he again quotes from the IMF report, which says that risks on Pakistan are quote unquote exceptionally high and the path to sustainability is narrow. He does also criticize the IMF severely, saying that a lot of the IMF's solutions will actually kill growth, because you cannot just manage the economy of a country like Pakistan only through austerity, by cutting expenses. You need growth, and there IMF has not come up with any creative ideas to promote growth. In fact, the demands the IMF is making will further kill growth. And then he concludes, and I will also conclude with his lines, and I quote, Pakistan is a canary in a coal mine in a world where almost 60 countries are drowning in debt, facing monumental risks from climate change.